Hello and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is grade 3 lecture 2 and today's topic is mixing continued, but instead of looking at facing bets today, we're going to look at having the opportunity to check or to bet and how to mix these two actions and which sizings to include in our toolkit when we are betting. So let's get started. Mixing check with one bet size is very much how we're going to simplify our strategy when it comes to the in-position game. Here is a hand I played against a fellow coach in my Discord server, someone that used to do some teaching for me, and is a very strong player. We're going to be playing fairly theoretically and solid here, not looking to do too much exploiting. I know obviously what this player's leaks are, but I'm not going to mention them all on this course for you guys. We go ahead and open here and pick up a call from our friend here in the big blind. We are the cutoff, and the flop goes check check on Jack 8-5. We're going to be playing a big bet strategy on this flop. You can play small bets here instead if you want. I would not recommend having more than one bet size here. It just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense and is incredibly difficult to balance with no real gain by adding that complexity. Given that we're using just big bets here, 9-8 is a hand that would struggle to small bet anyway. I mean, it could small bet, but it definitely doesn't want to make a B75 on the flop. Checking is going to be a superior line to that, so we like to check back. Turn brings the 8 of spades, making us trips, and our opponent checks again. This is a point in the hand where we need to decide what our toolkit is going to be for the turn. In other words, what sizings are we going to include and which ones are we not going to include. In position, the idea is that our turn checks can be mixed in with only one bet size. We do not need a second one here. Although the solver will spit out an output that has multiple bet sizes, we can just take one of them and actually rerun it just to make sure there's no EV loss from that simplification. This comes down to Clark's theorem actually deciding which of these bet sizes we would like to choose. The bigger the polarization advantage here, meaning the larger the gulf in polarization between our range and that of our opponent, the bigger we want to bet. Another way that you could phrase this would be to use the term nut advantage, or you could say something like the less capped your range is in relation to your opponent's, or the more condensed your opponent's range is in relation to yours, the bigger you want to go. We saw all of this in grade 2 of the Carrot Poker School. How big is the polarization advantage here? This is the question. I invite you to pause the video at this point and have a think about it. And assuming you've done that, the answer is it's reasonable, but not enormous. It's not a huge polarization advantage, because what a stronger player will do here, solver engine will do here, anyone that's studied out of position turn probe play, is actually check some good hands with the intention of check raising, check some decent top pair with the intention of check calling, and so they're still going to have an uncapped range here for the most part. It's not correct in game theory terms to cap your range in this situation as the out of position player. That's something you want to avoid. Therefore, we are the one with the semi-capped range on the flop because we don't check hands like pocket kings there, or pocket fives. These hands are too strong and actually must value bet at that point. While we are uncapped by the presence of the 8 on the turn, and while the 8 is a pretty good card for our range on the turn after we check back moving towards the middle on the flop, it's also a card that's going to leave some nutted stuff in our opponent's range and allow for them to check raises and things like this. Therefore, given we're not in a situation where we have an extremely uncapped range against an extremely capped one, we want to avoid overbetting for the most part here. While it might not be absurd to use an overbet in this spot, I think on the 8 turn it's important to just use the B75. I'd be much more comfortable overbetting on a turn like a deuce, because there it would be a bit more preserving of our good top pair advantage, and we would have probably more combos as a percentage of our range of things like Queen Jack, King Jack, Jack 10, hands that probably could overbet, but those hands can't really overbet on the 8. The 8x is a bit more shared here, despite my opponent's turn check. We use B75 or check as our toolkit, picking which sizing is going to exist. This is a bit like a plumber bringing a tool into a job. You may have a toolkit with him with lots of different things in there. There may be a wrench in there, there may be like a plunger for unblocking drains and things like this. But when it comes to actually doing a job, let's say unblocking a drain, they're only going to use the plunger. They're not going to take the other things out of the toolkit. So the toolkit is basically what we actually have available to us, and the bet size we use is the one we pick for this spot. Our toolkit here is basically B75, and since we only have one sizing in our toolkit, that's going to be the sizing we pick. Our hand is a mandatory turn bet now. It's a bit too good to check back a second time now that it's trips, and so we're going to go ahead and bet. Our opponent calls, and we head on over to the river, which is the ace of spades, and now we have a tier 1 hand. Our toolkit, however, the bag of tools that we have available at our disposal on the river, is probably larger now, because I can see we could have hands here that want to be 75. Maybe we have something like ace-x that bet turn for whatever reason is a bluff and now wants to be 75 in this spot. Possibly we just think that certain good jack-x is still good enough for this job because villain isn't calling a ton of ace-x to the B75, so maybe like king-jack, queen-jack. And then we're going to have a larger bet, which is going to be this overbet that we're going to mainly deploy with our 8x region. You could probably go even bigger than this still, but this is just the overbet I'm recommending to you guys to make things simple. Once you get used to B150, you'll get a feel for that sizing and how to apply it, and you'll be able to take it from there. The main idea here is that we mix check with one bet size on the turn, but possibly more on the river. That's based on the needs and wants of our range, while on the turn, we still have future streets to come. We have the river and we can make up for lost ground there. On the river, it's about time our hands start reaching their investment threshold or ceiling, because it's the last opportunity they have to do that. So we have bigger sizes for certain parts of our range and smaller sizes for others that are a bit too thin as value bets for the bigger size. What you'll note is it's always our value hands which dictate how big we are betting, and our bluffs will follow suit. When we're simplifying our strategy, what we want to do in a program like PioSolver, hopefully we have a custom solver at our disposal. If not, things are a bit trickier, but provided you have your own solver, you can actually run a subtree. To do this in PioSolver, you want to go to the tree menu and just select build subtree configuration. That will basically freeze the node that you were looking at, and you can then make sure all the bet options are correct for that node. For example, sometimes you will have a player who's not allowed to lead out of position, even though they should be, because it's the turn now and not the flop, and you need to change that in your solver inputs to make sure that they can do that. There's certain things you have to get right when you're building a subtree, but once you've learned how to do it, it's an incredibly powerful way of freezing the status quo at which both players arrived on the turn, and then saying, let's say we only have one option now. The reason that we don't just run the whole tree again is twofold. One, it would be very time consuming because we'd have to run the flop again, and two, you would actually reach the turn with the pre-existing knowledge in each player's strategy that they could only use one sizing on the flop. That would actually change the flop strategy and thus the landing ranges for arriving on the turn. So what you want to do is freeze that state of affairs after the players thought they had lots of different options, and then restrict their options so that you create a consistent tree. Here, the PioSolver output says that both sizes are permissible, the B75 and the B32. The overbet I just removed because it was barely using it. I ran it with these two sizes first just to show you guys what that would look like. And it said that because in position the cutoff has kept their range advantage here against the big blind, that theoretically speaking in position's range should be entitled to 63.21% of this pot, which is a really decent healthy amount. The complexity of this strategy is a luxury that the solver can afford, but we should reject. You will see certain people try to get overzealous and build multiple sizes here, but I can assure you, some of the best players in the world will use just one sizing in this spot. Understanding the EV gains that are purely theoretical and minimal won't really apply in reality, and that'll be unnecessary. Thus, we simplify by creating a subtree configuration which runs the spot from the turn landing ranges onwards. We can therefore compare our two simplification options. In other words, choose which direction we want to simplify in. The original turn output had 3 different sizes, and then we ran a subtree with just B33, and later a subtree with just B75 so we could see what happened to the EV. The base tree returns an EV of 63.21% pot for the in position player. Things are rosy, but does this get worse when we simplify to just one bet size? What we'll then do is, having looked at whether there's an EV loss, we'll use factors such as, firstly, how much EV loss there was theoretically, and then just how comfortable and intuitive a strategy feels for us. How well does it gel with the rest of our framework and our understanding of the game? If you've never studied using a small bet in position on the turn, and the solver says the big bet is fine, it's probably better to stick to what you're comfortable with. The first option was to give the solver only a smaller bet and remove its bigger option. You can see what happens to the EV here. It's actually gone from 63.21 to 63.55. The EV has gone up. What? How is this possible? When we reach a game theory solution in a solver, we're not reaching 100% accuracy. What we're seeing is therefore 2 different journeys to similar outputs that are actually slightly different. So when we run it with 2 sizes, the solver takes a different journey. The ranges go through different stages of contracting, expanding, using different blockers, trying things out, before they settle at a Nash equilibrium where neither player can gain any EV by deviating further. At this point, the EV is frozen when we stop the sim, and we'll be stopping it somewhere near equilibrium, but never truly equilibrium. That's why I like to use the term pseudo-equilibrium to describe this sort of thing. This sort of EV gain is very much just interference, it's noise, it's static. The reason it shouldn't be taken seriously is that we have looked at 2 different journeys, which while are very similar, they're not the same journey, and so we can't expect the EVs of running one tree to map exactly to those of running another tree. The solver is not necessarily saying it's better to use one size than 2. There's no logical reason why that should be the case, and in fact in most spots where you reduce the solver's options, the EV will go down. But because this isn't 100% accurate, you just see a bit of fluctuation here. In this case, it happens to have gone up, but that need not be the case. This strategy is of medium polarity. That means that the strategy is fairly tricky to apply because it does involve quite a lot of thin value betting, merging, and maybe just betting with hands that don't look like obvious bets. For example, betting almost always with pocket sixes here is a little bit weird, and you may not be used to having that higher bet frequency for this hand. Similarly, when you're using this block bet here, there will just be a bunch of other thin value bets like ace-queen that you wouldn't really be able to make for a bigger sizing unless you're comfortable finding those. I just don't think this is the best way to play. The way I would describe the situation is that instinctively we have a mediocre to good polarization advantage, so we should use a medium to big sizing, i.e. B75. That's the most sensible thing in my mind, just trying to make the spot more intuitive and less awkward. I therefore reject the B33 option, as long as the B75 doesn't cost EV, like the EV doesn't come in as notably lower, and sometimes students ask me, how much lower does it have to be before I reject it? And I really don't know the answer to that question, unfortunately. It's a theoretical value, so it's not actually describing what will happen to you in game if you adopt a strategy, it's just giving you a very vague approximation for what would happen solver versus solver if you restricted sizes. Therefore, it's really hard to say at what point things become relevant. I would say that when it's a few percent pot difference, that's definitely relevant, and when it's within 1%, it's much less so, but that's really as precise as I'd like to go with that. Remembering that EV of 63.55, which is actually the highest EV we've been able to generate so far with the two trees that we've ran, we're then going to do it again with the restriction that the solver can now only use the larger pink shade of bet, the B75. 63.55 now becomes 64.08. There is no evidence whatsoever then that simplifying to the bigger sizing costs EV. In fact, the solver says, by the way, it's better if you bet bigger here, which I don't believe is true. I don't think that this EV is actually something we should measure approximately, let alone exactly. I think we should just say it's noise, it's within 1%, like who cares? And when I see people actually obsess over this, my heart really saddens for them because they're truly missing the point of how to use solvers. You know, if you're sitting here thinking, I don't want to deviate from what the solver is saying because it knows better than me, just remember, you only gave it one problem to solve. You didn't give it all of the different strategies available, make it run a million trees and then tell you what to do. You just ran a tree and it gave you an output. That doesn't mean that you have to copy that output. Just because something recommends something doesn't mean there aren't lots of other good things as well. When you take a seat, for example, on a train, you haven't chosen the only seat that makes sense and all the other seats are terrible. Usually you've just grabbed a seat and lots of other seats would have been good too. This is what it's like when you're building strategies and solvers. You're looking at one output, but there are lots of other good ones that you could have ran. When we get to this situation, then the bet frequency goes down because we're using a bigger sizing. We have to value bet more thinly, and so there's a bigger median middle band of our range, which has to check now. That's our tier 4 as we introduced it in grade 2. And this strategy is of high polarization, therefore I think more intuitive. Typically, and in my opinion, strategies that use a higher degree of polarization are easier to deploy than those which require lots of mixing and merging. While we can still value bet some hands that may not look that good here like sixes, we're going to now be checking hands pure like ace queen ace 10. There'll be less of that really flimsy counterintuitive value betting going on. I chose B75 as my only sizing in the hand in question for two further exploitative reasons. Not just that it's easy to do, but there were another couple of things going on here I thought when I looked at the bigger picture. Firstly, it gives my friend the highest frequency of having to solve a tough river opportunity. If I let my opponent have to deal with turn bets when they have the bottom of their range at a high frequency, they have some pretty easy folds. However, if I say to them, I'm going to check back a lot here because I'm building a high polarization, large sizing turn betting strategy, then they're going to have to figure out when they can bluff the river, what combos to bluff with, what sizings to use, and how to remain balanced with a very wide range. And that's going to be a much more tricky and fiendish task than just facing a turn bet with air. I think I can possibly give villain the scope to make the maximum number of mistakes by actually inviting them to the river node where we go check on the turn more often. It's a really tough one to play as the out of position player with a range disadvantage. It may well be better too if pool is too capped after their second check. The idea is if, in general, the population isn't finding enough slow play with trips on this turn, and you can see the texture there at the top right, if they tend to bet an 8 too often or bet a jack too often, the bigger bet will actually increase my EV theoretically speaking, and in the real world too, because my value range will have more equity and will qualify for a larger investment. When choosing a frequency of B75 versus check in game, we should typically separate our hands into 5 buckets or sections. The 5 buckets of hands within a single sizing strategy. We have pure checks, these are hands that we will never consider betting. Usually a pure check will be a mediocre hand on the turn, but if the spot is very unfavourable, we will also be pure checking some complete air hands. If we go back to this sim here though, you won't see that many examples of total air that has to check. There's just a few that the solver deems quite horrible blocker wise, like King 4 suited. For the most part though, generally air combos can bet, and if you look at a good air hand such as Queen 7, something like this that doesn't tend to block as much of the brute force showdown value King High Ace High that's folding here in villain's range, then that's easily fine to bluff. King High has a bit of showdown value and it has bad removal. That's why you see that checking, but once your showdown value gets a bit lower here, you see there's just a lot of bluffing going on. Queen High is bluffing almost all the time, and then when your King High is a bit better and actually has 2 overcards, like King Queen, or even King 10 has 2 overcards to more pocket pairs, you're going to be betting that at a high frequency. There's lots of bluffing you can do here. Most hands that are pure checking are just going to have too much showdown value to bluff. Then we have hands that are going to bet infrequently. If we think about what those are here, they could be very thin value bets that do qualify for value betting but usually don't want to, lest they make the range a little bit too exploitable to check raising. 4s and 3s are good examples of this, these value denial bets are quite thin. Then we have hands that bet sometimes. These are going to be all different kinds of things, from bluffs to draws to top pair to hands that are just mandatory to mix with in theory because they're not pure bets and they're not pure checks. Therefore, if you don't mix them, you end up with a very imbalanced strategy. There's no short-term repercussion to that generally, but I will warn you guys that strong regs that know how to exploit their populations are going to be ready for you exhibiting the same leaks that pool generally exhibits. Therefore, if people don't check enough 8x in big blind shoes in that turn, you should make sure that you do when you're against a tough exploitative player. Then there are hands that want to bet frequently. Now, you don't need to assign exact frequencies to any of these buckets. It would be ludicrous to think that you could do so. To sit here and say this hand is a 34% bet here probably would just be making up numbers, and that's overly specific, draining, and pointless. Much better is just to say that pure check means betting pretty much never. Bet infrequently means betting sometimes but usually checking. Bet sometimes means about 50-50. Bet frequently means the majority of the time. You could designate numbers to this like 25, 50, 75, 100 or something like that, but it doesn't really matter as long as you just have an effortless way of randomizing when you think something is a mix and you don't have an exploitative reason to take a pure action. That's the main thing. Randomizing yourself is actually a bit fatiguing. I think like trying to be a random number generator for a human is quite an impossible feat, and we'd probably do better by deferring that task to some kind of algorithm that just generates it for us. What I would say is though that when you first start out with mixing, you need to be really careful that you're not actually mixing hands that are pure actions. If something is better to bet, in theory, you'd never want to mix it, and if something is better to bet exploitatively, you need to find that instead of just copying a theoretical mix. Let's see if we can help the rookie carrot mascot here locate the following hands within their range. We have a big blind versus cutoff spot, Jack 8-5 with the 8 of spades, same situation we just looked at. Where should the rookie carrot place these 4 hands? Pause the video, have a think about it, then I'll go over my answers. Assuming you're ready, Ace 7 is actually going to be a frequent bet. When you look at this hand, it's easy to suspect that this hand may be a check. You might well think, well, this is in the middle of my range, and so I don't think this is going to be a frequent bluff. If your showdown value was a little bit more, that would indeed be the case, and we don't see any betting whatsoever for B75, the sizing we're simplifying to here, with a hand like Ace Queen, Ace 10, or anything of that nature. By the time we get down to Ace 7 though, it's a bit more useful to generate that fold equity from a double Broadway hand, which is now more live and more unblocked, and it's also not so likely you're going to cooler someone by checking back and hitting a pair on the river as when you hold a hand like Ace 10. Therefore, this hand is slightly below the median, it does a lot of betting, and this is mainly to do with its unblockers to the folding range and the usefulness of the fold equity. Ace Queen is going to be a hand that pure checks, it's just too far up, it's in the tier 4 of our range, it's the median, so assigning any kind of bet frequency to this hand if you're using a B75 would just be a clinical mistake. Jack 9 is definitely a hand that looks like a value bet, but actually this one is a pure check also. The solver believes with a hand like this that it's actually quite mediocre and it's more depolarized on an 8 turn than it would be on another turn. If the turn card had been a 3 or something, you would see this hand doing quite a bit of betting here, but in this case it actually elects to check back. The idea is that against a solver, it does get raised a lot and it does run into an 8, and this hand will not actually block an 8 very well because the spade 8 is out there. It might be more permissible to bet with something like the Jack 9 of hearts, because that would block 9-8 suited, although this is a small point. This hand checks back, it waits until river and then it bets, but once the kicker starts to get better with the Jack, we actually bet a bit more often. Paradoxically, we actually bet some pocket pairs lower down than the jack here much more often than we bet a hand like jack 9, because value and equity, while they're a massive part of why you would bet here, they're not the only reason you would bet a pair. Another reason you bet is for the usefulness of your fold equity, aka denial, and when you have jack 9, you just don't really allow your opponent too many opportunities to outdraw you with their folding range. Not only do you have a card that's really high, that it's near impossible for villain to have 2 overcards to without 3-betting pre, but it's also the case that you block outs and draws with the 9, making it less likely that you get outdrawn. Note how ace-jack actually unblocks the 9 and doesn't have that effect going on. It's also just a bigger equity hand, which is why it value bets. That's a bit of a tricky exercise, and I think this surprises quite a few students, but hopefully you got something out of it. How do we build the RNG into these mono-sizing strategies? So again, into a strategy where we're just deploying 1 bet size and 1 bet size only. Pure check is pretty self-explanatory. If the hand has no reason to bet and outperforms betting by checking, then we don't mix with it. A common fallacy when people first start with solvers and trying to mix in general is that you need to mix every hand to disguise your hand strength or whatever. If you mix in a blunder, you just blunder X% of the time instead of 0, where X is more than 0. That's silly. Betting infrequently for me means betting about 25% of the time, so I have to roll a 75 or higher if I'm doing it that way. These days I actually use a low number to be aggressive, because that means I can say I'm going to bet up to 25% of the time instead of saying I'm going to bet on everything but something higher than a 75. I think there's a bit more mental acrobatics required if you do it with high number being aggressive, but it's totally up to you. Sometimes I just take that to mean 50-50, and bet frequently I just take this to mean 75% of the time. I don't teach my students to use any frequencies other than these, and actually in real coaching I rarely get this explicit about what frequencies should be. It's just taken as a kind of subconscious given that when I'm in a situation and I say bet often, my mind will go to the number 25 and want to roll under it to bet when I'm betting infrequently. When I'm betting frequently, I'll want to roll higher than 75 to check. River bucketing now. This is where things start to get a little bit more complex and difficult. This board, Queen 10-7, 5-3, is one that we can use a large sizing on as cutoff. The reason is that villain's range is fairly mergy here because they have a lot of second pair, third pair, gutter, straight draw, open-ended, and flush draw. So they have a lot of hands within that sort of mediocre equity belt. When you think your opponent's range is mergier than usual, that actually enables you to use a bigger sizing than usual because your range by contrast becomes more polarized, relatively speaking. The opposite of polarized is merged, so as they start to have a higher density of mediocre hands, you have a more polar range by comparison, all else being equal. The spots where our toolkit can only be simplified to 3 bet sizes, which is typically river, where we have too many different value regions that want different investment levels, and where we have an EV advantage and must therefore bluff wherever possible, our thought process is going to go as follows. Remember from grade 2 that when we have called the flop, for example, like we have here and have a river probe opportunity, this is exactly the kind of spot in which we have mandatory bluffs whenever we don't have a made hand, or whenever we lack showdown value. The reason for this, to recap, is because our fold equity is above and beyond what we need it to be to make a bluff. This is because when villain polarizes flop and then checks back on the turn, they're going to have forfeited their advantage and actually incurred a large range disadvantage on most textures. This wouldn't be true in all spots, and if the river was something really good for cutoff, such as a jack, then that would no longer be the case. But on a card like a 3, this card really just rewards the person that had a reason to stick around and not the guy that was betting absolutely anything on the flop. When I say absolutely anything, I don't mean literally whole range. Cutoff is going to be checking the flop with a hand like 9s or 8s all the time, but they are going to be bluffing often with a hand like the jack 6 of diamonds. This is not a hand big blind can hang around with, and so the 3 of hearts rewards the person who condensed. First off, step 1, we're going to estimate the bet size frequencies for our strategy by thinking about our value hands. If you imagine your range as a bus, the value hands are the driver and the bluffs are the passengers. The passengers will happily go where the driver is going because they got on that bus in the first place, and the driver will be the one that actually ultimately decides. We have a lot of Queen X and 10x here, so B33 is going to be pretty common. Some Queen X can bet bigger, but a block bet with a weak queen is going to be fine, and 10x is only going to be able to value bet for 33% pot. That said, 10x is still going to want to do a lot of value betting because its kicker is usually going to block our opponent's bluffs, making checking a less fruitful idea. This is going to be a really common thing in GTO. We're going to have tons of Queen X and 10x, therefore B33 will exist in a widespread way throughout our range for value. We have a little bit of really good Queen X that can actually use this sizing, but B75 will be quite rare because the 3 of Hearts river is polarizing. If this was a brick river, we could go ahead and B75 any Queen X and probably overbet the best stuff. In this case though, we need a better kicker to do it because ranges just get more polar and stronger on the river. Clearly, the absolute hand strength of one pair is going to decline on a flush card, even where our opponent doesn't bet the turn, though not as much as if he had. And we have a ton of 2-pair plus here. We have a lot of flushes, we have a little bit of things like Queen 5, 7, 5, Queen 3 suited maybe as well. So we just end up having hands that can go ahead and overbet because they're just drowning in equity. They have something like 94% equity, so there's no problem betting very large, causing a big contraction in your villain's range and then still being in great shape when called. The bigger your hand, the bigger you want to go for value. But what we're doing here today is not just looking at value betting. We did all of this already in grade 2. What we're doing here is expanding this and learning how to mix bluffing into this toolkit as well. You're going to want to bluff every time you're below a certain point in your range here, and so you need to know which sizes to use. The first thing I will say is that there's no real standard reason why a certain hand would have to bluff a certain size, with the exception of going very big. When you're going very big, you may oftentimes need to have a good blocker. So if you bet 400% of the pot here, it would be important to hold the Ace of Hearts or King of Hearts or something of this nature. However, if you're just betting 150, 75, 33, it's not so important to obsess about that. There isn't really a right bluff size theoretically. The bigger you go, the more fold equity you get. Basically, when your bluff works, you win the same size of pot, but you win it more often when you go bigger. But the downside is that when it doesn't work, you'll lose more money when you go bigger. If you went to buy a car and you saw 10 different cars of different prices and qualities, and the prices matched well with the quality, it wouldn't necessarily be correct to choose the cheapest car just because it costs the least, nor would it be correct to choose the car that costs the most. You would want to actually figure out what your budget is and how to get the best value for your money. When you're bluffing though, it doesn't really matter what your budget is. That should be unlimited. You shouldn't be caring about that. That factor doesn't come into play. When you're bluffing, you can just randomize. It doesn't matter which size you use because all bluffs have the same amount of equity. The only thing that matters is how big you value bet. So your value bets steer the bus, your bluffs sit and go where they're told to go. But you want to divide your bluffs up with a decent amount of balance, and you want to put them roughly in the right range at the right frequency so that it doesn't become the case that every time you block bet, you're bluffing, because that would be horrible. Your opponent doesn't need very much equity to bluff catch against B33, only 20% to be precise, so you don't want to load that range up with more bluffs than value bets. This is a common value hand. This is a rare value hand, and this is a common value hand. But this is a rare bluff, despite the fact that it's common value hand, and the reason for that is pot odds. When you bet 33% of the pot, you're only technically meant to be bluffing 20% of the time, otherwise villain has automatically profitable bluff catches that have average blockers. Villain should have some profitable bluff catches in their range and some losing ones, but their average blocker property hand should neither be winning nor losing by calling the river. In order to make those hands indifferent, which is your primary goal, you need to be bluffing sparingly with this sizing, even though it's a common value hand, because the bluff to value ratio afforded by these pot odds is not very generous, and you have to be pretty strict with how frequently you bluff. Usually, when I get to this river with air, I won't choose B33, but I will choose it sometimes. I'll choose this sizing even less often though, because I'm just aware that there are so few value hands in my range that want to value bet this size. Therefore, this is going to be a rare value hand, and although the pot odds I'm offering my opponent are now worse, and that allows me to put more bluffs into my strategy, if you're struggling to understand that, just think in terms of trying to make your opponent's bluff catchers break even. Your value to bluff ratio is the very thing that determines how well their bluff catchers do when they call you. This is important, but because this region is just not really value betting much, it doesn't get to bluff much either. It gets a better bluff to value ratio, or a bigger, more lenient bluff to value ratio than the block bet does in the B33, but it doesn't exist much for value, so it still can't exist much as a bluff. With the overbet, this is by far where the majority of my bluffs are going to go. The reason for this is it's a very common value sizing, and it affords me a generous, luxurious amount of bluffs to value. Therefore, this is a really common bluff sizing in my strategy. What tier is my hand is the first question you should ask yourself when you've reached this river. If you have a value tier, you can simply select the sizing that looks right, but bear in mind there will be certain hands that have anomaly factors going on that are going to skew the picture. For example, if you have a hand like Queen 10, you're going to block your opponent's calling range heavily, and overbetting may not be the best idea. it might be right to take that tier 1 hand and choose a tier 2 sizing with it because you're blocking too much of the calling range for the overbet to work well. Tier 1 will be 150, Tier 2 will be 75, and Tier 3 will be 33, those blocker phenomena aside for now. Tier 4 will check because it's something like 30 to 65% equity. It's not good enough to value bet, it's not bad enough to bluff, therefore betting is hemorrhaging money. And when you have a hand that's worse than tier 4, and in this case that can still have some showdown value, remember, because your range is outgunning your opponent's range fairly heavily, that means that fold equity is at a premium, it's above the break-even point or pot odds norm as we described it previously, and therefore you're going to want to bluff with everything that's below a certain point. If you look at the spot in a solver, you may be surprised by how high up the big blind is supposed to bluff here. I would first ask, is there any sizing that my hand has negative blockers for? So if I was using, for example, a B400, and we will talk about bluffing for this sizing and value betting for this sizing as well further down the line, in grade 3, we would probably want to have a very positive blocker because now almost all of our opponent's calls are going to be heart blockers and flushes. However, when we're betting a bit smaller, even B150, that's not so much going to be the case, but I would favour having a heart blocker for B150 a bit here. And if I thought the combo was closer, had other negative blocker properties, I might just put it into a smaller sizing. If the answer is yes, then we need to take that into account and eliminate one of the sizes and roll between the other two that are left. And if the answer is no, we can actually roll between all three of the sizes. But we need to be careful because we're not just rolling 33% to each size. We're not betting 33% pot on a high number and then on a middling number betting 75% and then on a low number betting B150. We're not doing that. We're actually putting most of our bluffs into our B150. So what I might do here in game is actually do something like 50, 30, 20 or something like this. Like put 50% of my bluffs into B150, 30 of them into B33 and 20 of them into B75. And that's just like an approximation. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're not playing against omniscient deities that are seeing our strategy and reacting. We're not pile solver, and thank God for that. In this spot overall, you can see that the overbet is used really frequently, but this isn't just with bluffs, this is with entire range. The important thing to note here is that while block is the most common size in the strategy, it'll be very value heavy based on the pot odds we're offering villain. On an RNG of 77 with a hand like this, we can basically say, okay, given that high in the Carrot Poker School, when this slide was built, actually means aggressive, so if you guys use high as aggressive, then this will indicate that you just overbet here. Do you have a negative blocker for overbetting? No. You actually have a really positive one in the King of Hearts. You just overbet here. B150 is your choice. The solver kind of agrees, but it's mixing all of the different sizes. With this particular hand, it barely block bets. That doesn't matter. We do not care, I'll stress this again, we do not care one bit how often we block bet this particular hand according to how often the solver does it. We just want to make sure that overall we don't mix too much of the B75 or B33 in there and usually stick to B150 on most rolls because that's the sizing that allows for most bluffs and is most common for value as well. That might not be true actually, the B33 may be more common for value, but the bluff to value ratio is just really not in your favour for bluffing often with that sizing choice. Let's apply this with an exercise now. How would you approach the following hands in this river spot on these runouts after the same action sequence? Let's say you have King Jack, the RNG is 15, and the board is Queen 10, 7, Queen 5. So the same action sequence, meaning that villain went ahead and B75 in position, you called the flop, the turn is a queen, check, check, and then on to the 5 of spades river. How would you play your hand here? How would you use that bucketing process? The first step is to say, what tier is my hand? This is our overall strategy, by the way. We'll come to that in a second, but clearly our hand is of a bluff tier, and it should bluff. We know that because it doesn't have much SDV, yet we're in a fairly good world for range, so I think we have to bluff this combo. The next question is to decide how often we'd be using each sizing in our toolkit. Because the 5 of spades river is a very polarizing thing that comes down here, villain will actually be checking back quite a few flush draws on the queen of spades turn, a little bit more than normal probably, and villain will be checking some trips as well. So they're going to have some trips, they're going to have some flushes, and then they're going to have some fairly bad hands. They'll bet a decent amount of their 10x on this turn, by the way. 10x actually becomes stronger when the second queen comes, so their range is a bit more polar here than it might look, and that's why we don't B150. We have this rule in game theory and in the Carrot Poker School, which is that when you're getting raised a lot, you don't have to go as big. The reason that we're not overbetting here with a flush is not that a flush isn't good enough to overbet with, it's just that villain's range is polar enough to raise smaller bets anyway, so we can count on that happening in theory. If you're against a more placid foe in this spot, you may just want to size up with your flushes. Our hand actually mixes between the two sizes in our toolkit here fairly evenly, and it makes sense that even though we do more B33ing overall, most bluffs are going to use B75 more frequently because it has a more generous allotment of bluffs available. You just don't want to be super bluff heavy when you're giving your opponent great pot odds. On an RNG of 15, which is a low number for our purposes, we're going to block bet this time, but had we rolled much bigger, we were going to be 75. The point is, we have to bluff, and we don't need to overbet as long as we understand that villains should be raising this river a fair bit compared with most other runouts. With King Queen of Clubs and the RNG of 43, how would you play the following spot? Same flop, same action sequence, different turn, different river. Have a think. Assuming you've done that, here's some data. This is a spot where our range retains much more of a nut advantage than previously, so we are going to go ahead and re-include the B150 on this sort of texture. Our hand, meanwhile, is not a bluff, so we don't have to go through the laborious bluff to value ratio part of this. We can actually just think in terms of how good is my value hand, what tier is it, and I think it's pretty squarely a tier 2 hand. That means that B75 is going to be our option with this hand. Note that because we're out of position and we're tricky and trappy out of position, we can go ahead and check raise on this node if we want to, or maybe check call if villain goes really big. We wouldn't be able to do this in position. This hand is not short of equity, it's just being tricky sometimes because we can still put money in the pot a different way. So B75 is our choice with this one. Hand 3 is the Queen Jack offsuit on Queen 10-7 two-tone, 10-8. This is a hand that clearly doesn't fall into a bluff tier either. We've rolled really high here, but that's not going to matter when we have a value hand because we're mainly just going to stick to our tier. We can sort of disregard the RNG and call it a red herring right out the gate here. What this means is we now need to decide how strong our hand is. Do we think this hand is tier 2 or is it tier 3? Clearly it can't be tier 1, and I don't think it's weak enough to be tier 4. Overall, the solver thinks that this is a runout on which we actually do pretty well nut-wise. We have a lot of 10x here after we call flop, we move towards that, whereas villain moves away from it when they B75 the flop, remembering here that villain used a bigger bet and a more polarized c-bet on the flop on these nodes. Then after turn check check, it's kind of a disaster turn for villain's range, a really good turn for ours, and then more of our draws get there on the river. Definitely we have a nut advantage now, we have a nutted region, we should deploy B150, not with this hand, but with some bluffs and value hands. B75 is the sort of sizing that jumps out of me for this holding. I think this is probably good enough for that, but it might just be a block actually. I don't remember the answer to this, I honestly don't. We'll see in a second, maybe this is just a block bet. And then checking is something you can do with certain hands as a slow play when you're out of position as well. This hand is just a block, it does lose a bit of EV to B75, so that would be overzealous. The idea being that, well, villain will be checking back quite a few overpairs and things like this on a 10 turn, and that demotes how good a queen actually is. B75 here looks okay, but this is actually a very different texture to the last one. You'll note that when the board pairs or flushes or something like that, hands like one pair are just going to go down in value. They're going to be a lower tier in general, and our range will use less big bets in general. This hand isn't really great for slow playing. You could slow play it, it's not really an EV loss here to check. One idea could be that the jack is going to block some bluffs, but not loads, because a lot of jack X hands, especially with the jack of hearts in them, will just bet immediately on the turn. Therefore, I don't think it's too bad to actually slow play this holding. On an RNG of 92, we B33 because we're not really looking at the RNG. It would be a huge failure here to say, oh, the number's huge, so I'm going to overbet, while forgetting all about the class of your hand. That would be trying to run before you can walk. And finally, we have the 6-5 back to bluffing again. The RNG is high, but we can ignore it because we probably understand that we have to bluff. However, this is a pretty gross river for our range. When we see this situation, we're going to immediately feel a little bit uncomfortable because we're aware that so many unique ace-king combos in our opponent's range have just got there and made the nuts. That said, we do have really good blockers here. We only have low hearts. These aren't big problems to bluff with. Villain is not going to be checking back turn with the 6 or 5 of hearts very often. Firstly, they're not going to have those cards from pre-flop, and they're going to bluff a lot of ace-6, king-6, king-5, ace-5, 5-4 on the turn for obvious reasons. So these aren't super negative blockers here by any means. They're actually positive, but this is a spot on which we need to be a bit more careful because our opponent has been so repolarized by the river and is now so incentivized to throw in a bunch of raising into their strategy. We can go small and rely on being raised whenever we have a hand here, such as a straight ourselves. Maybe we have 8-9 or 2 pair, we can get raised so we don't have to go big. We're getting EV in other ways on other branches in a way that we're not really doing on hand 2, where our range is more polar than our opponent's. Here, villain's range is more polar than ours, so we go small. It's just Clark's theorem again. Again, we don't need to RNG here because we know it would be a mistake to check. It would be an even bigger mistake to bet bigger though into a more polarized range. If you ever forget Clark's theorem, just remember, if your opponent has the nuts or air and you had to bet, you'd want to bet small. It's not that bad here, we're not saying that's his range, but that's why we use a small bet. We B33 this one, that's our bluff sizing. We value bet a lot for this sizing too, and there will be hands that maybe look like bluffs here but actually aren't. You'll see we're not gaining that much EV by bluffing this hand if you compare that to hand 1. Okay, we can't see the EV display there, but the EV is going to be really positive for bluffing King Jack in hand 1. There'll be no hand that's really positive to bluff here because the Jack run out in hand 4 is just so bad for us and so good for our opponent. Homework task 2 is to hone your river probing skills a little bit more, but on a drier texture. This is a 4-4 deuce 8-4 board, or in other words, a still lake, to use the words of grade 1. It's a texture that just basically doesn't help anyone's range. Have a think about how bucketing will now change due to this texture, and how absolute terms like 1 pair and ace high may change in value. Then go ahead and imagine having the following hands with the following RNG rolls, where a big number is either aggressive or passive, you decide. Do a pre-solver attempt where you decide what would happen with pocket 3s on a roll of 51, what would happen with queen 8 on a roll of 12, etc. And then have a look at a solver output, see where you went wrong, and post some useful conclusions that can help you learn from this spot. Hope you enjoyed these first 2 classes on mixing. I hope you won't take mixing too far and you can hopefully see when to do it and when not to do it. I'll see you back here for lecture 3 when you're ready. Good luck at the tables, guys, and bye for now.